The first call came in at 2:47. The dispatcher on duty that night was a corporal named Reyes. She had been on the desk for 11 months, long enough to know every extension on the installation by the second digit. When the line lit up, she read the originating number off her console before she even keyed her headset. Building 9. Go ahead. There was breathing on the other end. Not heavy. Not panicked. Just breathing, slow and even, the way a person breathes when they are listening to something on the far side of a room. This is dispatch. Identify, please. The breathing continued for 9 seconds. Reyes wrote that down later when she was asked. 9 seconds and then the line went dead. Not hung up, she emphasized, but dead, the way a line goes when somebody cuts power to the jack instead of returning the handset to the cradle. She logged it as a missed dial. That was procedure. A single anomalous call from an unmanned building at that hour with no follow-up did not require a unit response. Building 9 had been decommissioned for almost 2 years. The phones in it were supposed to have been pulled. At 2:51 the line lit again. This time there was a voice. Male, middle register, slightly hoarse, as if the speaker had been awake for a long time. He said only one sentence before the connection failed. There's somebody in here with me. Reyes dispatched a patrol. I want to be careful with this one. Most of what comes across my desk has the texture of folklore by the time it reaches me. Third-hand stories, scrubbed names, dates that don't quite line up. This one is different in a specific way. The paperwork survives. The dispatch logs survive. The patrol report exists in 2 versions, an original and a revision, and the revision is the one that was filed. I have spoken at length to people who were on shift that night, and to one person who was assigned to the building afterward and who asked me more than once to make sure I was not recording. What I can tell you is that this took place at a mid-sized Army installation in the continental United States, sometime in the back half of the 2000s. I am being deliberately vague about the location because 2 of the people I spoke with are still serving, and the facility involved is still standing though it is not in use. The building in question was an administrative annex, a 2-story flat-roof structure of the kind the Army built by the thousands in the 1960s, all cinder block and linoleum and dropped ceilings. It had housed a personnel processing detachment until the unit was deactivated. After that it sat empty. It was not haunted in the sense that word usually carries. Nobody had died in it. There were no local legends attached to it. It was an unremarkable building on an unremarkable street on an unremarkable post, and that is part of why the incident is interesting. Whatever happened there did not arrive with a story already wrapped around it. It arrived through a phone line, and the people who responded to it had no framework for understanding what they were responding to. I'm going to walk you through what is on the record and what people who were there have said about what is not. The installation ran a standard military police rotation. 3 shifts, overlapping with a desk supervisor and 2 to 4 patrol units depending on the night. The shift on duty when the calls began was a Tuesday into Wednesday graveyard, which meant a thin roster, Reyes on the desk, a sergeant named Hollis as shift supervisor, and 2 patrol teams of 2 officers each. The patrol that responded to Building 9 consisted of Specialist Mateo Aguilar, who was driving, and Private First Class Devin Yost, who was riding. Both were experienced enough to handle a routine call without supervision. Aguilar had been MP for 4 years and was waiting on a slot at the investigator's course. Yost had been on the road for 14 months. They were friendly with each other but not close. They had worked the same shift for most of the previous summer. The drive from the MP station to Building 9 took about 6 minutes at the speed limit. Aguilar remembers the radio chatter on the way over as ordinary. He remembers asking Yost whether the building still had power, and Yost saying he didn't know. Remembers thinking it would probably be a busted window or a homeless veteran who'd worked out which doors were unlocked. They had cleared several buildings like that during the previous winter. When they pulled up, the building was dark. That should be said plainly because it matters. The exterior lights were off. The interior lights were off. The parking lot was empty. There were no vehicles, no signs of forced entry, no broken glass. The front doors were chained from the outside with a padlock that the MPs themselves had inspected during a property check 3 weeks earlier. The chain was undisturbed. Aguilar called it in. Dispatch 2-4. We're on scene at Building 9. Exterior is secure. No signs of entry. Stand by while we walk the perimeter. Reyes acknowledged. They walked the building. It took 8 minutes. They checked every door. There were 6, and every ground floor window. Everything was intact. The rear loading dock was sealed with its original roll-down shutter, locked from the inside with a mechanism that could only be operated by somebody standing in the loading bay. The fire exits were chained. The HVAC intakes on the roof were too small to admit a person and were, in any case, 22 feet off the ground. There was nobody inside Building 9. There could not have been. Aguilar called Reyes back and told her the building was clear. He asked her to verify the originating number on the calls. She did. The calls had come from extension 9 to 114, which the post phone directory listed as a second-floor office formerly assigned to a finance clerk. Reyes ran the line through the base switchboard to confirm it was still active. It was not. The extension had been disconnected at the panel in 2007. She told Aguilar this over the radio. There was a pause. Then Aguilar said, "Say again." She said it again. Aguilar and Yost stood in the parking lot for a few minutes after that. Aguilar later said he remembered the cold very clearly, even though it was September and the night was mild. Yost said he didn't remember the cold but remembered the silence, that the building had a particular quality of silence to it, the way an empty refrigerator is silent in a way that a turned-off refrigerator is not. They were preparing to clear the scene and return to station when the third call came in. Reyes' voice on the recording is professional. You can hear, if you know what to listen for, the precise moment her tone changes from the bored cadence of routine dispatch into something flatter and more careful. It happens mid-sentence. 2-4 dispatch. We have another inbound from the same extension. Stand by. Aguilar acknowledged. He told Yost to get back in the vehicle. They sat with the engine running while Reyes patched the call through to their unit radio so they could hear it. This is the part that exists on tape, and which I have listened to, and which I will describe rather than play because the people who gave me access to it asked me not to broadcast it. The voice was the same as the second call. Male middle register hoarse. The words were clear. They're in the hallway now. I can hear them. I don't know how they got in. I've been here the whole time. Reyes asked the caller to identify himself. The caller did not respond to her directly. He continued speaking, but not in the manner of someone holding a phone to their face. The voice had the quality of someone talking to themselves while a phone happened to be in the room, distant, unfocused, as though the receiver were lying on a desk. I locked the door. I locked the door. I don't think the door matters. Aguilar requested permission to force entry. Hollis, the shift supervisor, came up on the net. He authorized it. He also dispatched the second patrol team, 2 officers named Kreutzer and Park, as backup. Aguilar and Yost cut the chain on the front doors with bolt cutters from the trunk of their vehicle. The doors opened inward into a small entry vestibule with a second set of doors beyond it. The second set was unlocked. Aguilar found this notable enough to mention twice in his report. The building had been secured from the outside, but the interior security door, the one that would have been the last line between the lobby and the offices, had been left open. They went in with flashlights. The power in the building was off at the breaker. Aguilar confirmed this later by physically inspecting the electrical panel in the basement. The breakers were in the off position, taped over with the yellow tape that the post facilities office used to mark decommissioned circuits. The tape was intact and dusty. There should have been no way for a phone in that building to make an outbound call. They cleared the first floor by the book. Lobby, hallway, offices, restrooms, break room, supply closet. Everything was as it had been left when the building was mothballed. Furniture under sheets, file cabinets empty and propped open. A calendar on one wall still turned to a month 2 years prior. There was no sign of recent occupancy. The dust on the floor was undisturbed except for their own footprints. They went up to the second floor. Aguilar took point on the stairs. Yost was 3 steps behind him. They cleared the landing and turned into the main second-floor corridor. The corridor was about 60 feet long, with offices on either side, and a single window at the far end. Aguilar swept the corridor with his flashlight. He saw what he expected to see: closed doors, linoleum floor, fluorescent fixtures hanging dark from the ceiling. He also heard something. This is where the accounts diverge, and I want to be honest about the divergence rather than smooth it over. Aguilar, in his original report, wrote that he heard a low voice, speaking continuously, originating from somewhere in the middle of the corridor. He did not specify the words. When I spoke to him about it, he said the voice had been saying the same thing as the third call. I locked the door, but he was not certain whether he had heard that in the building or whether he was importing it from the dispatch tape afterward. He said memory does that. He said he had thought about it carefully and could not separate the two. Yost, in his original report, wrote that he heard nothing. When I spoke to him, he confirmed that. He said the corridor had been silent for him. He said he had watched Aguilar's shoulders go rigid and had assumed Aguilar had heard something on the radio, until Aguilar turned around and asked him very quietly whether he heard it too. They proceeded down the corridor to office 9 to 114. The door was closed. It was not locked. Aguilar opened it and entered. Yost remained in the corridor, covering. The office was empty. The furniture was as it had been left. A metal desk pushed against the wall under the window, a chair tipped onto its side on the floor, a filing cabinet with its drawers removed and stacked beside it. The phone was on the desk. It was an old multi-line office phone, beige plastic, with a coiled handset cord. The handset was off the cradle. It was lying on the desk beside the base, the way a person might set it down if they had been called away mid-conversation. Aguilar approached the phone. He could see, even from the door, that the cord running from the wall to the base was cut. Not unplugged. Cut. The jack end of the cord was lying on the floor beside the desk, severed cleanly with no plug attached to it. The phone was not connected to anything. He picked up the handset. He said later that he did this without thinking, and that he regretted it for a long time afterward, though he could not say exactly what he regretted. He held the handset to his ear. He expected silence. He heard breathing. He heard breathing for what he estimated was 4 or 5 seconds, slow and even, and then he heard a voice, not the voice from the calls, a different voice, lower and closer, say something he refused to repeat in his report and refused to repeat to me. He set the handset down on the desk, the way it had been when he found it, and he walked out of the office and he told Yost they were leaving. They left. Kreutzer and Park arrived as Aguilar and Yost were coming down the front steps. There was a brief, sharp exchange in the parking lot that Hollis later described as the only time in his career he had heard Aguilar raise his voice. Aguilar told Kreutzer not to go inside. Kreutzer asked why. Aguilar did not answer. Park, who had known Aguilar for longer, looked at his face and said, "Okay, Mateo." "Okay." They sealed the building. They put new chain on the front doors. They called Hollis and told him the building was clear and that nothing further was required. This was the first deviation from procedure. A call of that kind, a voice on an active line, a request for help, an indication that a person might be inside, should have triggered a full search, a notification to the duty officer, and a written incident report with audio attached. What was filed instead was a brief patrol log entry describing a misdial from a faulty extension and a property check that confirmed the building was secure. The original recording of the third call was, according to Reyes, pulled from the dispatch archive within 72 hours by somebody she did not know, who showed her a memorandum she was not allowed to keep a copy of. She signed an acknowledgement. She was reassigned to day shift the following week. The story would end there, and would be the kind of story that gets told in MP shacks for a few years and then forgotten, except for what happened to Aguilar afterward. He did not sleep well for the rest of that week. This is, by itself, unremarkable. He had been on graveyard shift for months and his sleep had been bad for a long time. What was different, he said, was the quality of the not sleeping. He would lie in his bunk with his eyes closed and feel very distinctly that there was a phone in the room with him and that it was about to ring. He would get up and check. There was no phone. He had not had a landline in his quarters since he had been issued them. On the third night after the incident, he woke up at 2:51 and could not remember going to sleep. He was sitting at the edge of his bunk with the lights on. His boots were on. He had no memory of getting dressed. He said this was the moment, more than anything else that had happened in the building, that frightened him. He went to the post chaplain the next day. Not for religious reasons, he was not a religious man, but because the chaplain was the only person on the installation he could speak to without it going on his record. The chaplain listened to him for an hour and then asked him a question that Aguilar repeated to me twice, because he said it was the question that allowed him to keep functioning. The chaplain asked, "When you picked up the handset, did you answer it or did you listen?" Aguilar said he had only listened. The chaplain said, "Then it has not finished speaking to you." Don't pick anything up for a while. Yost transferred off the installation 6 weeks later. He had requested the transfer before the incident, so it was not a reassignment, but he did not delay it. He told me when I spoke to him that he had no lingering symptoms from that night. He said he had heard nothing in the corridor and seen nothing in the office, and the whole thing had been, for him, a strange but uneventful call. He said this in a calm and considered way, and I believed him. He also told me near the end of our conversation that he had not been able to use a desk phone for several years afterward. He said this without seeming to notice he was contradicting himself. When I asked him about it, he became quiet for a long time, and then he changed the subject and we did not return to it. Reyes finished her enlistment on day shift and did not re-up. She works in civilian dispatch now for a county sheriff's office in a state I will not name. She agreed to speak to me on condition that I not describe her current workplace. She was the most matter-of-fact of the people I interviewed. She said the calls had been real, the voice had been real, the extension had been dead, and somebody above her had decided that none of those things were going to be on paper. She said she had stopped being angry about it a long time ago, but she had not stopped thinking about it. I asked her what she thought had happened. She said she did not have a theory. She said theories were for people who needed the world to make sense, and she had decided some time ago that she did not need that. She said the only thing she was certain of was that on the night of the calls, somebody in that building had wanted help, and the system she worked for had been designed to provide it, and the system had functioned exactly as it was supposed to function, and it had not been enough. Hollis retired as a master sergeant. He declined to be interviewed. He sent me a short message through an intermediary that said only, "I signed what they put in front of me. I would sign it again. Please leave my family out of this. I have honored that. Aguilar is the one I spoke to most. He left the army at the end of his contract. He did not pursue the investigator's course. He works now in a job that has nothing to do with law enforcement, and he is, by his own description, content. He has a family. He sleeps through the night most of the time. He is in his 40s. He told me one more thing which I have thought about a great deal, and which I will share with you because I think it is the closest thing to a meaningful detail that this case contains. He said that for the first year or so after the incident he had a recurring intrusive thought. The thought was that the voice on the third call, the one asking for help, the one saying they're in the hallway now, had not been calling out. It had been calling in. The building had not been trying to alert dispatch to an intruder. The building had been trying to reach a particular person, and the call had been routed to the MP station because the MP station was where that person worked, and the person the building had been trying to reach was him. He said he knew this was not rational. He said he knew the calls had originated from a disconnected line in an empty room and that any narrative wrapped around that fact was just an attempt to make the fact bearable. He said he had told himself this many times over many years. He said it had not stopped being his first thought, every time the phone rang at an unexpected hour for the rest of his life. I want to be careful about adding context here, because the temptation with a case like this is to fill the silence with adjacent material until the original incident feels explained. It cannot be explained. Adding more material does not change that. What I will say is that Building 9 is not unique in the way that matters most. There is a category of report, scattered through MP and base security archives across the services, that involves communications from facilities that should not be capable of communicating. Most of these reports involve radios rather than phones. A transmission on a dead frequency, a call sign that has not been used in decades, a voice on the squadron net that does not match anyone on the roster. They are usually written off as crosstalk from a civilian source, or as a prank, or as equipment malfunction. Sometimes they are written off as nothing at all, which is to say they are filed and forgotten. I have read perhaps 24 of these reports in the course of researching cases like this one. They have certain features in common. The communications are usually brief. They usually involve a request either for help or for acknowledgement. They almost never repeat from the same source. The personnel who receive them are, in most cases, conscientious and procedurally competent, which is part of why the reports exist at all. Less careful personnel would not have filed. I am not suggesting that these reports describe the same phenomenon. I do not think they do. I think they describe a particular kind of failure in the relationship between a built environment and the people who are responsible for it, a failure that becomes legible only when the environment behaves as though it remembers being occupied, and the people responsible for it are required, by their training, to respond as though that memory might be a person in distress. Buildings in the military are not neutral. They are assigned. They have unit designations, mission histories, occupancy records, maintenance logs. They are tracked through their life cycle the way personnel are tracked. When a building is decommissioned, it is processed out in a way that closely resembles the processing out of a soldier, paperwork, inspections, a final accounting. The building, in a literal administrative sense, has a service record. I do not have a thesis about this. I am only noting it because I think it is the closest thing to a frame that the people I interviewed seemed to reach for, without quite saying so. Aguilar said something near the end of our last conversation that I have not been able to shake. He said that when he had picked up the handset in office 9 to 114, he had not felt as though he were intruding on someone else's call. He had felt, very specifically, as though he were the one being called, and the person on the other end had been waiting a long time. I want to summarize what we know and what we do not know before I let this rest. We know that on a Tuesday night in the late 2000s, 3 calls were placed from extension 9 to 114 in Building 9 of a continental U.S. Army installation. We know the calls were logged by a dispatcher whose competence is not in doubt. We know that the building was sealed from the outside, that the power was off at the breaker, that the phone in the relevant office was physically severed from the wall jack, and that the extension had been disconnected at the panel almost 2 years previously. We know that 2 military police officers entered the building and conducted a clearance. We know that one of them heard something in the corridor and one of them did not. We know that one of them picked up the handset of a phone that could not have been ringing, and heard a voice through it and would not say what the voice said. We know that the recording of the 3rd call was removed from the dispatch archive within 72 hours by an unidentified party with paperwork authority. We know that the patrol report was revised before filing. We know that one of the responding officers experienced a period of acute sleep disturbance afterward and sought informal counsel from the post chaplain. We know that, to the extent the incident has any official existence, that existence is now contained in a one-line patrol log entry describing a misdial. We do not know who placed the calls. We do not know how the calls were placed. We do not know what was in the building, if anything was. We do not know what Aguilar heard in the handset. We do not know whether the corridor sound he reported was external to him or internal. We do not know who pulled the recording or where it is now. We do not know whether Building 9 in its current condition is still capable of doing whatever it did that night, because the building has not been occupied since. It is still standing. It is still on the post-property rolls. It is, according to a current facilities directory I was able to consult, scheduled for demolition in a fiscal year that has now passed without the demolition having been carried out. I do not know what to do with that fact. I am noting it because it is true. The last time I spoke to Aguilar was on a Sunday afternoon in the spring. We had been talking for about 2 hours. He had been generous with his time and patient with my questions, and I could tell he was tired, and I was preparing to thank him and end the call. Before I could, he said he wanted to tell me one more thing. He said it had not been in any of the reports and he had not told anyone, including his wife, and he was telling me because he thought I would understand why he had not told anyone, and because he thought, at this point in his life, that somebody else should know. He said that when he had set the handset down on the desk in office 9 to 114, when he had decided he was leaving, he had not set it back in the cradle. He had set it on the desk beside the base, in exactly the position it had been in when he found it. He had done this deliberately. He had not thought about why at the time. He had only known, with the clarity that sometimes arrives in those situations, that he was not allowed to hang up the phone. He said he thought about this often. He said he understood intellectually that the phone had not been connected to anything and that the position of the handset could not have mattered. He said he understood also that some part of him had not believed this and had acted accordingly, and that the part of him that had acted accordingly had been, in the moment, the part he most trusted. He said the thing that bothered him more than anything else from that night was not what he had heard in the handset. It was that he had known without being told what to do with it afterward. He had known the rule. He had not been taught the rule. The rule had been waiting for him in the room, the way the phone had been waiting for him, the way the voice had been waiting for him, and he had obeyed it without question, and he had left. He asked me what I thought that meant. I told him I did not know. He said that was the right answer. He said anyone who told him they did know would have been lying to him, and he had appreciated over the years that I had not lied to him. He said he was going to go now. He said he hoped I would be careful with what he had told me. He said goodbye and he hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after the call ended. The line was clear. There was no breathing on it. I returned the handset to the cradle and I made a note of the time the way I always do when I finish an interview, and I closed the file. It was 2:51 in the afternoon. I noticed that and I wrote it down, and I have been thinking about it since. There is a version of this story in which I tell you what I think happened. I have written that version. I did not keep it. The honest answer is that I do not know what happened in Building 9, and the people who were there do not know either, and the institution that was responsible for both the building and the people has decided, in the way institutions decide things, that not knowing is the answer that will be allowed to stand. What stays with me is not the voice in the handset. It is the gesture Aguilar described at the end, the careful placement of a disconnected phone on a desk in an empty room, by a man who had been trained his entire adult life to follow procedure, and who in that moment was following a procedure he had never been taught. I think about what it means to know a rule without having learned it. I think about whether the building taught him, or whether the rule had always been in him and the building only gave him the occasion to use it. I think about the difference if there is one. I do not think Building 9 was haunted. I think Building 9 was, for a brief window of time on a Tuesday night in the late 2000s, doing something that buildings are not supposed to be able to do, and the people who were nearest to it responded with the only tools they had, which were a flashlight, a radio, and the habits of their training. Was almost enough. I find that almost the most unsettling part of all. Good night.